I think understitching is the sewist's secret weapon. And unfortunately though, a lot of sewing patterns do not want to tell you about understitching and don't show you how or why or even say to do it at all. And I'm talking understitching, not top stitching. More on that in a minute. I want to show you not only how to understitch and why to understitch, but mostly where to understitch. I've got at least 125,000 samples here to walk you through and show you the areas where it's best used so you can use it on your garments even when the pattern doesn't tell you about it, and you can make your me-made garments look $1 million with our secret weapon of understitching. Let me get all these samples in order first. Sewing friends, welcome! It is so lovely to see your smiling faces again. I know they're smiling back at me, I know. Let's talk understitching. Now, this video here on understitching happens to be one of my very most viral videos, if you would call one, on YouTube here. Maybe it's actually how you found me. And if you haven't seen that video already, I am definitely going to link that down below for you for after this one. Watch this one first to watch. And that is how to understitch. That is everything of breaking the secrets of what understitching is and how to. I'm going to go briefly over that, but we'll concentrate on other things. We'll build on those skills in this video. So briefly, what is understitching? Understitching is a stitch that you do on your machine that is underneath the outside layer, and then it holds any facings, linings, seam allowances in place underneath. Now I guarantee you have seen this before, but you don't want to confuse it with top stitching. So this one here, as you can see, is understitching. It is underneath and hidden. Whereas this one here is top stitching. You can see it goes through all of the layers, the top layer included. And I know you're thinking, what kind of wizardry is this? How would you sew it? It's actually really, really easy. So if you have any area that is fabric folded over one another, and we're going to go all the places of where to do it in a moment, but you would fold, say, your fashion fabric, and you've got a facing through here, and then you fold it flat so that your seam lays out. Then underneath, you need to push all of your seam allowance towards your facing or whatever the lining side that is underneath the underside of your fabric. And then you sew through the underside or the facing or the lining and through all of those layers of the seam allowances underneath, capturing them all, and it helps then stay. And when you turn it, flip it back over, there is no stitching on the front of your garment at all. There is no visible stitching left at all. Versus top stitching, which is just stitch simply all the way through all the layers there. So as again, a detailed tutorial is in a video I'm going to link down below, but I don't want to go into detail because let's just say we know how to understitch, right? And the real reason why we understitch is the same reason as you might top stitch. The most common reason is to keep things from flapping around, namely facings are a big one. So where you've got that facing, and you know how it usually flaps around all the time, this one is actually stitched down, but you know it flaps and moves and rolls out and pokes out against your garment. You would understitch, just like this one here actually. This here, my facing, I have understitching through here to hold that down in place. So this one could flap around if I didn't have it. As opposed to top stitching, I don't have any visible stitching on my garment here, which gives it a really nice look. And that's what it does. It just gives a different look as opposed to top stitching versus understitching. Have a look in your garments in your wardrobe of ready-made clothing. I 100%, I bet money that you have clothing in there that has understitching on it. So I highly recommend to study those clothes, have a look and see where it's used. But hey, let's do that together right now. Let's go through a bunch of samples and examples here of where to use this understitching. Facings are the most used place, I think, where understitching is the most appropriate. So just like my garment here with my facing that would be flapping around otherwise, I've used understitching to hold it down, hold everything in, and it naturally helps curl it over and under so you get a really nice neat finish from the top side. So this here, no stitching visible whatsoever, but when you look underneath, it has top stitching all of the way around this facing. And so the facing is also hand sewn down here, otherwise that could be flapping. So the understitching is right along the seam, along the neckline edge. It can be neckline facing, armhole facing, or even a hem facing. So this here, my green skirt, I actually have a hem, it's a facing along the hem that hems it. And you can see on the outside of the fabric, I have hand stitched the hem up. So there's only a tiny bit there, and then you don't see anything on the bottom here. But if I'm to turn this over and we look really closely at what's going on, we can see I've actually understitched all the way along, and it helps naturally roll that under. You can see there's a little bit of the top side fabric rolled over. It naturally does that, so then it gives a beautiful flush finish to the outside. As I said, whether this is the neckline edge, your armhole edge, it's really, really used. Facings are like the number one place to use it. This also applies for bias facings. Now, you know bias facings are one of my favorite finishes. I love them for around armhole edges on sleeveless. So I have a bias facing around here. This one's interesting, so I did both. So you can see there is a top stitch along the outer edge here where I've top stitched the bias facing down, but there's no stitching along the inside edge here. But if you look on the underside, I do have 2 rows of stitching. So this one here is understitching and this one is top stitching, because this one is underneath and is not visible from the top at all, is all hidden, and there's only 1 row through there. It really, really helps with that bias facing to fold it over and keep that nice, beautiful, crisp edge on the front where you don't see any facing from there. So it naturally helps it roll around because it stitches all that seam allowance in with it and just helps push it all over the edge so it curls around just ever so nicely. And you can see here on this one, on this facing, it's understitching all the way around here as well. Okay, so very similar to facings is lining. So this little cutesy secondhand number I just found has a lined bodice, and we can see what the construction is here. So let's take a closer look, because it does have both a facing and lining. And so the lining here is as a bagged out method. So that's where the fashion fabric and your lining are joining and there's nothing in between, and they're sewn and then it's just folded over and there's just at the seam here like this, you've got lining and facing. That's called a bag out method of lining. There's lining up here, which is attached with a facing. It's just so that, say, on this nice top area, you get more, if any of the underside was to show, it's your fashion fabric and not the, other colored lining fabric that might poke out. But you're going to sew this amazing anyway in the future, and there won't be any poking out lining facing parts at all. Coming back to this, taking a really good look, we can see that we've got understitching all around the armhole here and all along the front. It's all around this neckline edge on both the facing and the lining, which helps roll it round and keep it really nice. Now, I don't have a lot of lined garments, but this jacket here is a good example of where it is actually not understitched, but it could be. So this is a lovely vintage garment that is well worn in my collection. But as the lining attaches to the facing here, there is in fact no stitching at all. So it wasn't top stitched or understitched on here, but it really could be. So what it would be is that in here, this facing would come up, all of the stitching would come in here, and then you would stitch along here, keeping just this layers on top. Okay, so before we move on to the next area, I want to show you a couple of examples that have not utilized understitching, but different techniques, and maybe why that was. So this little number here that we've got has a band around the entire neckline to kind of face it as a little band. So this is the right side, and if we look on the inside, we can see this band here. And so we've got stitching along the under and the top here, but if we turn it back over to the right side, we can also see that there is stitching along the top and here. So both of these are top stitching that we can see. So this one here could have been understitching, but my guess is that the designers chose top stitching because that's just the look they're going for. They knew they were going to have top stitching through here and through other areas in the garment, and they just wanted to echo that stitching all the way through. You know, like when you get jeans, they're all top stitching, right? It's part of the look. And so that's a reason why you would use top stitching over understitching for different areas. Another example of where they haven't used it, and maybe why, is this here. So on this lovely little balloon sleeve here, if we look inside, it is aligned, right? Let's get a better look at this. All right, so we come in here and we can see this is bagged out and put in here. So this is lovely cotton lining inside. And this is actually stretchy so that when it stays on your arm, it kind of stretches. And the top is bigger as when gravity happens, this balloons over itself like this. And so if we look really closely at this seam, there's no understitching or top stitching, but that's because this has elastic here. So when you stretch it, like it needs to stretch. It could be stretched and sewn, but there's not really any need for it. The elastic inhibits it a bit, and because this is actually hidden, because how this sits, this folds down, naturally this folds over. See how much? And this actually lays flat rather than if this was lined and it was supposed to sit you know, like this, say, and this was the edge, you probably would find this would be understitched because it would help hide that seam and roll that over. But because this is naturally meant to fall over the top, and it just then, it has a completely different look and finish. And so that's why that particular area with lining is not understitched. I hope that gives you a few examples of the lining and facings. I've got some more coming up because another one is collars. Let me get my collar here. All right, let's have a look at what we're looking at. This gorgeous one here, such a pretty fabric, right? It's so gorgeous. It's cotton silk foil, so lovely. So the understitching is done any areas that are sewn and folded over each other, and then you understitch to hold one of them down and roll it down further. So it can be any areas. As I said, facings are probably the number one, and then collars and things like that are number two because, well, there are two places. You stitch them together, both sides of the collars, and you turn it inside out. And one of them you want to roll under so that it doesn't, you know, it doesn't poke out over the top, right? And so looking at this collar here, we can see no top stitching on top at all. It's got a beautiful, clean finish to it. But if we turn this over, we discover there is in fact stitching all the way through here. So this is understitching versus if we look, the stitching on the collar stand down here is visible here and both sides on the underside as well. This is top stitching because it goes through both sides. But the understitching is used so that it gives the collar a nice clean finish without having visible stitching all the way over it because, you know, my opinion, it would really ruin the look. This is something delicate and finer and you want an understitching look rather than top stitching on something. And that's just the different looks and like feel to the garment, the look of it that you want, or ultimately the look that you want to choose. Because the whole point of this is when you start to understand how to understitch, what it is, because I mean, that's mind-blowing when you actually figure that out for the first time and notice what it is versus top stitching. You get to then see your patterns, and your patterns will often might tell you to understitch, but they won't call it understitching. They might say to fold fabric over and stitch the seam allowances and the lining layer all together, and you're just trying to follow that step by step and it makes no sense. When you call it a name, that technique, because it is a technique, is called understitching, you instantly know what to do. You're looking at your garment that you have in front of you yourself and you know the places. This is the key. You know the different places where it should be used and for what reason. You can now start taking control and start using understitching wherever you want in your garment and start really making beautiful, more high-end finishes and get better results and just get those, looks like $1 million, right? With those wonderful finishes, even when your pattern doesn't tell you to do it. You know what it is, so you can choose to go off pattern, as I like to say. This is one of the first steps in that off pattern journey where you get to decide the look you want your garment to be. You are the designer, right? If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up, give it a like, and if you really enjoyed this video and my content, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe to my channel. Now double check, because YouTube will often show you lots of my videos, but you're not subscribed. It's kind of like a tips jar for me. It helps me know, and the algorithms, of course, YouTube know you want to see more of my content and really does help my channel. So thank you for that. I really want to hear in the comments down below your understitching adventures and how you best use it. And remember to read those comments down below because it is like a goldmine. We're all here to help each other's sewing journey, so make sure you read and like those comments down below as well. Until next time, my sewing friends, happy understitching. Bye.